something that I've always kind of teetered on the edge of. And when it comes to service and it comes to belonging and leadership, it was really well surmised by one of my bosses, Len Pierre, who said that leadership is a submission to duty.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself. Samantha, please go ahead.
Chichim Heakwa Uklama Samantha Jack. Hi, my name is Samantha Jack, and I come from Nuu-chah-nulth and Yale First Nations from the Johnson and Jack families. But I spent the majority of my life growing up in urban spaces and wondering how I become part of the community around me or pull in community around me. And I think a lot of that is shaped where I've ended up throughout the different avenues or pathways of my journey, I would say. But um from the land, all the same, from the land all the same.
Okay. And and Samantha, just I have also listeners from outside of the US. Where in the US are you um, based at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm based in Surrey, British Columbia,
Mhm.
here on the West Coast. My family comes from the entire West Coast, or the majority of the West Coast of Vancouver Island, and then just upriver, near Hope in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, from the Fraser River.
Okay. And again, I was wrong because I should have said Canada, right? Part of not the
Yeah.
US. So really, for those who are not familiar with the US and Canada, they are neighbors, and this is on the eastern, on the west side. And you still live there until today. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, tell a bit about your upbringing, friends, your parents, or your caretakers, siblings. How was that?
I have a definitely an interesting upbringing, but I wouldn't say it's wholly unique.
Uh-huh.
There are many other and young indigenous people that have very similar stories to mine, but and so I'm gonna lean into that a little bit today. My families have been impacted by the legacy of residential schools, and through navigating that pain and navigating and reconnecting to who they are, they haven't always walked the safest path for them or the healthiest paths for them. And um through that journey, my grandmother, both of my grandmothers, had many children. So I have many aunts and uncles. But my father and my mother, both were had time where they spent time away from family. So my father, my biological father, is a person I have the one of the closest connections to, but he was scooped from my grandmother on the island in the 60s and placed for adoption in Vancouver area, away from the island, away from anyone that could foster them or adopt them. That was quite an intentional tool of colonization to ensure that, you know, there was more of that assimilation going on. Um, and so my father and his twin brother were placed for adoption in Vancouver, and my adoptive grandparents um, adopted them. So my dad had a urbanized experience for most of his life, being taken away from his family and placed in the city, and uh, in a very upper middle class white community as two very visibly indigenous children, that presented their own sets of experiences and challenges when it comes to racism and identity and that that sense of belonging to community as well. So that impacted my dad. And as he was going through his, usual male teen phase, looking for things outside of himself, he happened upon my mother at a party, no the less. So I'm always told that I was the epic result of a party, and if I have to live with that, then so it is everyone else. Um, but my mom, she didn't have an easy path either. My mom, she was the oldest of all of my aunts and uncles, um, and was charged with looking after them most of the time. Um, I'm very proud of where my mother's family is has ended up, and my grandmother. And my grandmother is no longer drinking. She's very much a figure in her community in downtown Vancouver. But I don't have the same connection I'd hoped I would have with my mother's side of the family. But my father has always been in my life, very much in and out. But there was a custody battle for me when I was younger because after I was born, because of the traumas my mother had experienced, she had lapsed back into a relationship with substances. And so I spent most of my time growing up with my dad and my adoptive grandparents. And so we were kind of like this blended family. But my dad also struggled with substances. And so he was kind of in and out of my life throughout the first few years, but always a constant and always someone I knew I could depend on, through it all. And growing up, that was an interesting journey for myself, as a young child. How do you navigate, intergenerational trauma? How do you understand the complexities of addiction, and how do you explain that to a child that feels, you know, that loss of someone who's one of your persons, and they're not there with you, or they don't have the capacity to be there with you. So that taught me a lot of patience and a lot of grace from a young age, and always assuming and wanting to see the best in people. And I think that's really it's been something I still carry with me, is a real foundational lens that I look through. I always try and assume people have the best intentions because you never know what they're carrying when they come through your door, or they come and sit or circle with you. So um it's a lot when you say it
Uh,
out loud, but that all shaped my experience and how I grew up in a very non-Indigenous space in a very
uh-huh.
white community, and being the only visibly Indigenous girl in many of the spaces throughout French immersion, throughout elementary, even into high school, that really taught me to distance myself from my identity. So it wasn't actually until later that I really stepped into my community and stepped into my identity, and that came as a result of a loss, unfortunately, because it wasn't just my wonderful grandparents. It wasn't just my father, but it was also my uncle, my godfather, who was like my dad's twin. They were so close together. And he always believed in him. Anytime my dad, was not on the right path, and needed someone to be a champion for him, it was my uncle that would go and pick him up and bring him out in the fishing boat and kind of give him that dignity and that grace and that love. Not to say that my not to say that my grandparents didn't, but he was always a fierce champion for him. And so I knew my identity was important, and I knew my culture was important to my family. But because of how I grew up and the spaces I grew up in, facing bullying, facing discrimination, racism, the othering in general, that was very hard for me to celebrate at a young age. I didn't have the tools or the emotional complexity to understand the layers and the beauty that lies within my identity. And I wasn't shown that in the media. I wasn't shown that through movies, or so there was not a lot of positive role models in the early 2000s when it came to celebration of Indigenous culture identity. And so um, after I lost my uncle, I went to his funeral with my dad and my best friend because I needed emotional support too. Um, and the room was just alive with culture. There were so many Indigenous people from all across different nations and communities that came to pay their tributes because he was chief of his nation, actually secured fishing rights for his community as well. Um, and so I was so profoundly moved by how many people could speak their language and were wearing their regalia, um, and singing songs that their ancestors sung, generations ago, still in the same way. And there was something that was so beautiful and so haunting about that in the moment, that I knew that I wasn't just grieving for the loss of my uncle in that moment. In that moment, I knew that I was grieving for myself too, and what beauty um was in the room, and what grief there was not to have any connection to it, or so I thought in the moment, right? Um so my university actually offered its first Intro to Indigenous Studies course the following semester. Like right after the funeral happened, I remember getting a notification. Um, and in Indigenous communities too, we talk a lot about spirituality and things happening for a reason. And I never really believed it until that moment, because it just felt so. It felt like such a catalytic moment and
Yeah.
such a profound like realization of, this is exactly what I needed to do. I needed to learn about our shared history. I needed to learn about who I am. And it almost felt like my uncle was the one orchestrating it for me on the other side, telling me it's okay. You can learn who you are and be proud of it. And there are people that are willing to support you in that. And that was also hard for me to kind of to learn to accept too, but I took it.
Uh-huh.
And I had a wonderful Dene woman, Kachina, who was my professor at the time, that really recognized the layers and the complexity that I was navigating, and really encouraged me to really do the work, um, knowing that she would be there to support me in doing it. And now I'm able to say who I am, where I come from, who my family is, our creation stories. I can share a little bit of our language, but it's all a practice, and it's a daily practice, and it's intentional. And ever since then, that was about 9 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. Um, it's fueled me every step of the way. Every step of the way, I think of, you know, I get to do this now, and what a blessing that is. And I do it to ensure that there never has to be any other Indigenous youth that felt the same way that I felt in some of those spaces, carrying those same weight, on their shoulders, or on their heart, or on their mind. Um, and I think that's really, altogether, saying it out loud, that is a lot. But I
Uh,
think that there's so much power that comes from that, because we want to ensure that we are moving forward in the right direction, and that we learn from the things that maybe have once hurt us, to ensure that there is an ample amount of love given and offered through those experiences, because people won't talk about that. I wasn't ready to talk about it with people, which is why I think I had so much love to give to other people, but maybe not to myself at that time. But
Thank you for sharing that, Samantha. When I was listening to you, it felt like um, a rebirth. When you experience that, is that? Is that maybe yeah, how would you call that yourself? That moment where you were there, saying goodbye to your uncle, but then all these other things were happening as well, and it meant a new start almost, right, for you.
yeah, I think a lot of that moment had to do with letting go of shame. There's a lot of shame that I carried for not knowing who I was and where I came from. And that also made it really hard for me to want to reach out or to be curious because I'd wondered, and I've always had this question since, and it's part of that, imposter syndrome that comes up. I still have days even now, even offering myself grace, but knowing, you know, the question looms of, am I indigenous enough? You know? And I know I'm not alone in this because I've had the wonderful opportunity to connect with so many, urban indigenous youth and youth from different school districts all over, and really know that, well, this is my reality and this is my lived experience and my story that I'm sharing. It's really not. There are so many youth that I've shared their experiences not exactly like mine, but is similar enough to know that when I shared my story that they didn't feel alone. And I think that's also another reason why I do this. There's a youth that shared with me, saying, um, "You're the first person to make me feel like it's okay to be me." And I think that's why that moment of rebirth, or that moment, um, that I had at my uncle's, was so important, and something that I always come back to. It's because I allowed myself to let go of that shame and realize it wasn't my fault that I didn't grow up in community, right? Like, these are the systems that Indigenous people encounter and engage with every day. And so, if I can offer myself grace in that, then I'm hoping other Indigenous youth can offer themselves grace in that too, and release that shame, and be okay with being curious and stepping into ourselves. I never like to say, that I finally connected to my culture. No, it's deeper than that. I stepped into myself, and I stepped into who I was always meant to be and who my ancestors always wanted me to be. It was a powerful moment when I look back at my uncle's crib.
How did your um, grandparents react to the change then?
Hmm. So my grandparents are actually have always been some of my biggest supporters.
Uh-huh.
My uncle is my grandparents' best friends. They all grew up together in Ladner, BC, and so they've always just had such a tight knit relationship, always supporting one another in their endeavors. And my grandfather and my uncle actually went to law school together. So they survived through thick and thin, blood, sweat, and tears, going to UBC for law. Um, and so they've always been encouraging of reconnecting to my community and my identity. And they always knew that that was difficult in the city, and that was difficult when there weren't other people like that around me. They always encouraged my relationships with my biological families. uh, I remember even once they took my uncle on my mother's side, and I to Disneyland together. They really were, the bedrock that I could always fall back on. To They've always encouraged my education and really tried to provide me with tools that are needed to navigate, this complex world. They saw that for themselves, as regular, everyday community members, but they also realized the real complexities that I would face as an Indigenous woman, and tried to give me every opportunity available, to kind of lean into those spaces with a lot of courage and armed with knowledge, and knowing that I could do so fearlessly, um, with their support always. So yeah, I couldn't have been blessed with any greater, um, parents, really, um, to shepherd me in my life.
Thank you for sharing that. I misheard, so my apologies as I did, but I think you said about your dad, your biological dad. You
Mm,
said he was always a person that I could rely on.
mm,
That's what you said.
yeah,
Did I hear that correct? Yeah.
yeah.
Which is pretty remarkable then if he had many struggles as addictions. So yeah, that's pretty special. I think I think a lot of children whose parents might have been addicted might have yeah, there's ups and downs, right? If a person needs. So how was that for you? And your how did he do that then? How did he manage, despite his own struggles, that he was still there for you?
With my father, I think there was a real experience he had when he was growing up where his parents weren't in his life, or couldn't be in his life. My grandmother, um, on my father's side, his biological mother was um, chronic, chronic alcoholic, would drink constantly. Um, and I know that took a toll on my dad. And I also know that that similar experience on my mother's side was felt. And I think there's a real willingness to try and be there as much as he could, knowing the impact his absence would have on me and what that feels like, I think, as an adopted young person as well. I think my realization is hard fought. I would say I've been on the dark side and I've been on the light side of both situations. There was definitely um, some resentment that that I had to grow through, um, some anger that I felt growing up, just wondering why, everyone's parents would pick them up at the school and mine wasn't. It was my grandparents. Um, but I think once I took that Indigenous Studies course, I had actually learned about what intergenerational trauma was and how that shows up for people. And I feel like it was explained in such a beautiful way that, removed a lot of. I like to be very intentional about my words. I'm a word nerd. But I wouldn't say it removed fault, but it shifted how accountability looks like in our relationships when someone is dependent on substances. And people can have multiple, strong reactions when it comes to harm reduction. But I truly believe that if substances or alcohol were not in my parents' lives, they would not be here today. Um, and for that, I know they were doing what they could to look after themselves. Um, and I'm grateful that my father is still here with me to this day. But I know that there are multiple different experiences and levels that come with people who experience addictions. Um, but in terms of me and my relationship with my dad, I wouldn't change anything. There are some hard nights,
Mhm.
but there are also beautiful moments. Moments of connection and security and love and something that goes way deeper you know than anything that can come out of a little baggie.
Mm. Yeah. Well, again, thanks for sharing that, uh, Samantha. Um, yeah, tell me a bit. So then you did that special course at and so how did you go on with your education then? Which direction did you go? Because I know at the moment yeah, you're considered to be a youth leader, an educator, a policy advocate. And I would like to hear more about that as well. But how did you get there? So how did your education school go from, well, basically since the funeral, right? Because then it all started.
Yeah. So I think it even starts a little bit before a university journey too, because there's a statistic that I always remembered being told um, about Indigenous people. And I remember the statistic was it was more likely for an Indigenous person to go to jail than it was for them to graduate high school. And I remember hearing that a lot throughout high school, and I didn't want to be defined as a statistic. I wanted to kind of emerge from that, and I wanted to challenge what people's conceptions were, preconceptions were about Indigenous people, um, because I never really solely identified as Indigenous person. I always thought, how am I really truly that different than anyone else in my class? And why is this maybe a binary that people are placing upon me? And so I always wanted to challenge that. And I definitely had a unique experience with perfectionism growing up too. I think that's pretty common for some people that have gone through the foster or adoption systems. I think there's always a wanting of or a feeling of, if I was perfect, maybe my parents would come back. If I was perfect, then this would get better or life would feel easier. So I think there was a bit of a, two um, two real drivers of me wanting to succeed in my education, but also the admiration I had for my family. I look at my uncle and how he went to law school and was chief of his community. I look at my grandfather, who is a criminal defense lawyer, who always believed everyone had the right to, human dignity and proper representation, no matter what their circumstances in life were. Um, and I decided that I also wanted to go to law school. I never made it there yet. Well, yet, because I went to political science. That's a good way to get to law school, is what I told myself. But what I actually found in that program was community of people who wanted better for this world, a community of people who wanted to use policy, um, to better circumstances, create better circumstances for all sorts of people, newcomers. We look at unhoused people, people without housing, our planet, how uh, how sustainability comes in hand with policy, and so it was just a real interesting landscape that I found within the political science department, and definitely got me thinking a bit broader than just myself and my community and my experience, into how does this global solidarity come together, um and how do our young voices really matter in those spaces too. So I saw a lot of opportunity for innovation in those spaces, and I think that youth have always been real drivers of change in a lot of those advocacy spaces. And so it really propelled me forward, wanting to know, how can I contribute.
And well, you are definitely contributing. You are involved with a lot of things, right? Um, yeah. So the net, if I'm informed myself correct, the National Association of Friendship Centers, the
Mhm.
Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Yeah, you know, and yes, you're also doing work that is UN related, right? How do you say that? Um, yeah, you're the focal point, the North American focal point of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus at UN. So tell us tell us a bit, how did you get involved and what are you actually doing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So all of this kind of came from the start of grassroots advocacy. And it was an interesting path that I found myself there. It was actually through my university when I was looking for those community circles and where do I belong. Um, I found the friendship centers, which are incredible, incredible places. I wish more countries could replicate this program that we have that runs nationally. It serves from coast to coast to coast here in Canada, over 120 friendship centers all across this country, serving over 1 million Indigenous people every year. Um, Urban Indigenous, specifically, people every year. And I got connected and really realized just how many of us lived in cities or away from our home communities, and what it meant to be an urban Indigenous youth or an urban Indigenous woman. And so I got connected at my local center, Fraser Region Aboriginal Friendship Center Association, or FRAFCA, for short, because in not for profits, we love acronyms. And then I got connected to the Provincial Indigenous Youth Council. So I was kind of put forward to be on that. And I got to learn more about how the provincial government engages with urban Indigenous people. I got to advise on the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples here in BC. Um, Realized we had a bit more of the drawing board to go back to on that one. But really, really exciting to kind of put my own education and my lived experience into practice at the same time in order to create an informed change for the beautiful province that I live in, which felt really special. And I heard I heard vaguely about a national association of friendship centers, but I'd never attended one any of their events, so it felt very ambiguous to me. But once I went, I saw such a beautiful community of Indigenous people just wanting to see each other thrive in spaces that are not very traditional to us, and what does that look and feel like, and so it felt like a real privilege to be able to be part of that. And the following year, I decided to put myself forward for the youth council, and um, that was 4.5 years ago. No, 3.5 years ago. And I ran for president against one of my lovely friends, and I lost by one. But I put myself forward for youth executive,
Yeah.
and won. And now
Wow.
I'm in my second term.
And tell us a bit about the friendship centers. What is that exactly about? What is being done there?
Yeah, so friendship centers, we offer programming from anywhere to prenatal to end of life care. So we offer anything and everything in between. Uh, we offer uh, we offer doula. We offer um, postnatal. We offer mother classes. We offer childcare in some of our spaces. We offer clinics in some of our spaces. We have also opportunities in other health services, advocacy services, housing services. Um, Justice in some cases, supports for people within navigating the justice systems, education as well. We have some people connected to, post secondary or also finishing up in general life skills to really round out what the urban Indigenous experience is. And how we can strengthen people to be contributors to the community and join us in sharing of culture. And I think that's really the biggest driver is culture is integrated into all of our service deliveries that we offer, and it's really what allows us to offer that real hand of friendship in spaces we wouldn't expect.
Wow. Wow. Um, yeah, and then tell us in terms of what you do then more at the United Nations level as the representative or the focal point.
Yeah, so I got connected at the UN through the
Hmm.
Friendship Center movement. It's
Yeah.
always been something I've been very interested in as a international relations girl. Um, there was always something I was aspiring to. I wanted to learn much more about what the UN does and what it offers and how it can protect, but also uphold the rights of Indigenous people, but of all human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. And just always something I was geeking out over, and hopefully where I'm hoping to end up in my career. But I got involved through the Friendship Center movement, and being able to go and attend as a representative of the urban Indigenous communities felt really exciting. And I just once I was there, I was wrapped in so many beautiful spaces with so many other inspiring, intelligent, intentional Indigenous young leaders that I just felt that kind of fuel to keep going in the work that I was doing and learn about the innovations that they were doing and the social innovations they were able to do in their communities and for their communities. Um, and I just wanted to stay as connected as I could. I'm pretty sure I annoyed everyone when I was there for the first time because I was running around asking, "What can I do for you? How can I help?" um, but I got connected to the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, and it's so incredible to see when young people put their voices together in such a beautiful and collective way, knowing that they won't be ignored, that they have this opportunity to ensure that we're represented well, that we're connected to our culture, that we're walking alongside the leaders of today to shape for the generations of tomorrow. And I knew I needed to be part of that. Um, and so I got connected and found many incredible friends that I still hold dear today, many mentors. And I ran for North American focal point to help other North American youth better navigate these international spaces because they can be very confusing. Not just their layout, but how other processes as well. And so that felt really, really special to be part of. And I'm no longer the North American focal point. We had elections this year, and I was unable to attend this year, but
Okay.
I am still a North American focal point for the Youth Policy Board for the World Food Forum at the Food and Agriculture Organization, which I
Okay.
just accepted. So I'll be
Wow.
working
Cool.
with FAO on biodiversity this
Okay. That's
summer.
great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Um, I would like to piggyback on what you mentioned in terms of walking along. This podcast, um, I don't know if you know, but this is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I started to do in 2012 to raise awareness about ending hunger, poverty, and injustice, and peace. To talk about that. But during COVID, I was not able to. I was still able to walk, but not be able to walk with others because we needed to keep distance. So then I started this podcast to virtually walk. So that's kind of how I see this as well. We are virtually walking. Um, so the walk that I did was about 100 mile in 5 days, 5 to 7 days. So I always ask a question around walking as well in terms of what would motivate you to walk 100 mile in 5 days? Or in other words, what drives you, right? What drives you in life?
What drives me? I think it's something that I've always kind of teetered on the edge of, and when it comes to service and it comes to belonging and leadership, it was really well surmised by one of my bosses, Len Pierre, who said that leadership is a submission to duty. And I felt that what drives me is my duty and the duty that I have to community to ensure that every young person, they deserve to feel that they belong, that their voices matter. And I felt like what drives me is helping us be co-contributors in those leadership spaces because often, too often, we're almost there as a in a, like a consultative manner. Sometimes youth leadership can feel very extractive. And so, what drives me is ensuring that we're building those meaningful relationships as young people, that we're able to really feel ourselves represented and not maybe in a tokenistic way. I think that's something that we're looking overall at many organizations, are seeking to wonder where what the secret ingredient is for youth engagement and youth representation. I think maybe we got a little too comfortable with what youth representation or youth consultation meant, and we're also seeing as the world evolves and our communities, our values shift a little bit, especially when it comes to what's happening to our planet. That leadership, will show up in a different way. And I think we just need to allow us the grace to navigate what that new space and that new relationship can look like. So what drives me is really ensuring that belonging, that responsibility, and that service to each other is important. That creating and that meaning, that we have.
Maybe talking about meaning as well is, when I then walk, physically walk, I often talk with my co-workers, either they might be, more senior, more seasoned, and emerging leaders. Um, we often talk about, why are we on Earth? What's the purpose? Because you get pain in your knees after a couple of miles. I mean, why am I doing this, right? Um, so I'm then very interested always, what is happening with the younger generation, and spirituality and
Mm.
religion. Is that different than how the more seasoned seniors, have approached this? And of course, I know, it depends on context. Certain countries are different than others, but in general, what you often see is that the younger generation maybe is steering away from institutionalized religion, and that
Mm.
spirituality is more important. And that might be, you know, again, different for indigenous population as well. Anyway, my question to you is, I would like to hear, what are your thoughts on youth and spirituality, and what do
Mm.
you see happening within your own community, in the community where you are? And I do understand maybe you're sometimes feel torn in between the different communities and how that is. But what do you see in your environment around youth and spirituality and religion?
I think young people today are searching for meaning, but I think they're searching for purpose. Beyond that, I think they're searching for belonging too. I know that was something that I looked for, and I looked for it in many places as well. I think that's something that is very unique to an urban perspective. I've been able to learn about and engage in the different spiritual and religious aspects of this world as well. I've sought it in Buddha, Buddhism, sorry, and Christianity as well. I've had so many different lessons from so many different rich perspectives and histories and cultures of this world, and uh, in my search, I think for purpose and meaning, but I think the biggest driver that I found is a search of connection. Um, and I think that's really what I guess spirituality is kind of um, moved towards or shifted into, is that space of connection. And it's about not just connection to one another, because I also believe that as human beings, we are meant to belong to one another, just as we're meant to belong to this land. And I think that reconnecting to my spirituality, especially as an Indigenous person, meant first and foremost connecting to the land. And when your whole life you've been taught to view the land in one way, and that being that it's a resource to be extracted and modified and commodified and used, um, that sense of connection that you might have um might need some tending to. There's definitely some unlearning and relearning I had to do when it came to understanding what my connection is meant to feel like as an Indigenous person. um and I think it was something that I always knew, even as a young person. Like, I remember, I'm more of a girly girl now. I blame the city for turning me into that, but as a child I was very much out in the woods, out in the mud, running with my bare feet, free, uninhibited, type of a person. Now I might have some questions about what bugs might be in the trees, but it all comes back to the understanding that I knew just how important that connection to the land was for me. And I had such a privilege of growing up on the beach and being able to go and be with the ocean and letting the ocean kind of cleanse me of whatever it was that was on my head or in my heart during that time. And so for me, my connection to spirituality really grew from the land, and it was always there, but I just never tapped into it. And it took me a while to understand how to tap into it. And it's still a practice that I'm kind of learning and understanding how to weave into my daily life. Something that's very intentional. But what supports my spirituality is the meaning and the connections that I make with the people around me too. You know, in order to navigate this vulnerable side of myself, and how vulnerable it feels to navigate your own spirituality and your own connection, you need people around you to lift you up when you're wondering, really, why am I doing this?
Thanks, Samantha. I, you use the word belonging uh, a lot, and um, maybe that's also connected with connection.
And
Uh, and what I hope that this podcast is contributing to is connecting people. There's so
Mhm.
much polarization. I really think people should, you know, there should be more dialogue and listening. And maybe the first step within that is connection. And so, in trying to kind of push for that, I'm weaving also a question in the podcast. Uh, a question from the previous guest for you. So I'm connecting you with the previous guest, and the previous guest has a question for you.
What does it take for us to uphold truth? Is what I would think.
I think this is an interesting question to kind of remunerate on. Because we see especially within, we'll say, some UN systems, but also federal, provincial, and municipal systems that have a very clear definition of it's this or it's this. You know, the binaries that exist within our society as well. But when I look back and I think about decolonization and I think about truth, I think yes, there is a very definitive truth. Um, but when I hear truth, I think of truth and reconciliation, and I think of our very real shared history in this country. But my elders also tell us that decolonization means that we have to honor that two things can be true at the same time, and that there's more than one reality at play. There are multiple coexisting realities, um, which is, coming from a political science, very academic background. It's hard for me to suspend my disbelief, to honor those realities. But I think we are so driven in this society to want to see things one way or another. And I think we need to be able to practice more grace and have more patience for what is rather than what we would like it to be. And I feel like in this society, we're seeing just how ingrained, um, we'll say, instant gratification culture we're living in, instant gratification time we're living in, when you can, click on an app and food will be at your door in 20 minutes, or you can buy something from Amazon overnight, and have it shipped to your door. I think there's not as much time taken, for truth, and truth in more than one presentation of it. There are multiple presentations of truth, and I think that, you know, when we look at truth and when we look at, you know, mistruth, or, the fake news, we'll say that that's out there as well. It's increasingly difficult to navigate those spaces, because what we're really looking for is not maybe necessarily the truth, but what we're looking for is hope. Um, and I don't like to wait around for that. Me personally, I don't like to wait around for hope. I like to witness it throughout everyday moments, and think of things that I'm grateful for. And I understand to some that can seem kind of wishy-washy, but it's a daily practice, and I think that it's definitely allowed me to sit with that kind of ambiguity around truth, and whose realities we're seeing and experiencing, but whose perspectives are also not contributing to these stories that are being told. And how do we round out that perspective, and how do we sit with that discomfort of not knowing whose truth we're referring to, or whose truth needs to be here. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
try to build on that. Where do you still see hope?
Mm. So hope for Indigenous people, I think, is probably similar to many other communities too. But I think for Indigenous people, it lies in resilience. The realization first and foremost that we're still here, and what a privilege that is, and that we still have our mother, the earth, to look after. And I'm probably a lot different than people in my communities. I've maybe heard the term naive once or twice. I think that's a common misrepresentation of young people, but it reminds me of that Latin phrase, while I breathe, I hope. Um, and I think that's really important to hold on to, um, especially in a world that's so divided over which truth is correct. But we know objectively, the truth of the planet and where we are in terms of the climate and climate change and desertification and ocean acidification. I think there's hope for me in in resilience and in recognizing that there is still a possibility for us to lean into solutions, and I think we need to be able to unlock our courage a little bit more. I think being hopeful is an act of courage, and I wish more of us will lean into that and be courageous. Because ultimately, when you have that and you have that clarity of what the need is, or what the problem to be solved is, or what we need to do to advance our community in a safer and better way, and you can have that clarity and you can call on your courage, uh, you can act and you can bring people together to do so. And so resilience is one thing, but hope is also about clarity for the future and clarity about our shared values.
Um, I think if I listened uh, properly to you, you don't speak the language, right? You don't speak your okay. Because then I would have asked you what is the word of resilience and hope within that, um, because that's often interesting to and then to unpack it. Um, so maybe in a period, a couple of years, right? And then we come back. Um, Samantha, you were explaining about the work that you're doing at the UN level as well. I'm assuming you're familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We should reach them before 2030. Goal one, ending poverty; goal two, ending hunger, etc. Unfortunately, um, on average, we are already only around maybe 15 to 17%, and we are already in 2026. Um, so a growing group of people is saying, those changes in our systems, in our processes that we need to accomplish to get to those goals, um, we are behind with, reaching those goals because we did not pay proper attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual, as well as a community. So, and therefore they developed 5 inner development goals:
Mm.
being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. And under those 5 IDGs or inner development goals, they identified 25 skills that you should work on as a person and as a community. Things like you have mentioned, uh, you know, um, yeah, and other things are empathy, critical thinking, forgiveness. Um, So my question to you is have you heard, I mean, having worked and are working in the space of at UN and on these 17, I am assuming that you've heard about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but have you also heard about the inner development goals? And yes or no, any thoughts on that? Um, yeah, in terms of yes, they are spot on, or well, yes, but yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I've heard of both before. I really appreciated the I think the values and the tools given of the interdependent goals as well, because we I think countries are trying to solve these these goals in isolation. um, but the reality is they're not felt in isolation, so they shouldn't be worked on in isolation. Is my first, I think, opinion around the Sustainable Development Goals, because everything within the Sustainable Development Goals, especially from an Indigenous perspective and experiences, everything is connected through those goals. You know, around justice, around equity, and but also around collective responsibility. Sorry. And when we look at the IDGs, you know, we're looking at being and ways of thinking, of relating to one another, of collaboration, but also I love that they ended on acting, by the way, because it's wonderful to be able to think and reflect, but it's meaningful. It's not as meaningful if we don't act on that knowledge. Um, and I think it's all connected through human integrity and curiosity and that shared responsibility, and being able to act on it with that courage is important for me. So the work of changing the world isn't happening in isolation, um, but it also means changing ourselves, and changing ourselves is not separate from changing the world.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. You know, really, these conversations always go fast. I still have a couple of questions that maybe we can try to tackle in a more, rapid fire type of way. Um, First, I should not forget your question for the next guest.
Hmm. I think my question for the next guest would be, um, how does community shape who we ultimately become? I think that's my question, because community is shaped pretty much every aspect of who I am. And I just am wondering, how does it show up in other leaders? And as leaders, what is our responsibility to allow community to shape who we ultimately become?
Yeah, music is very important to me. And so I always have a question that is related to music. So my question to you is, if I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that for a big part embodies what you are about, who you are, which song or piece of music would that be and
It
why?
Okay. So the song is called "A Rock Somewhere." Slash the Seed. It's a Greenpeace project that was brought forward by Jacob Collier and Aurora, and I'll send you the typings of those. But I think that song spoke to me because they offered this musical collaboration in front of the melting glaciers, ice glaciers in the back. And there was just something so beautiful about, you know, the power of nature and what it can create, but it also reminds me of the responsibility we have to protect it, and protect it not just selfishly for ourselves and our families and our communities, but using that seven generations thinking of, how am I going to leave this better for the next seven generations, and how am I going to be a good ancestor when I hear this, you know, how does this call me forward, to do my duty for Mother Earth, but for your children too, and your grandchildren, and your community neighbor, and your nurse or your doctor. Who It just reminds me of the interconnectedness that we all have as human beings, and how we are meant to belong to each other. And so that's the song that I always go back to.
Great. And a great song. I love Jacob Collier, so I'm happy that we can add another song. And maybe this is the first time a song of his is added to the playlist. Um, if you go to Spotify and you search for hashtag Walk Talk Listen, you will find all the songs that have been selected by my guests. So no, thanks for that. Um, yeah, if I ask you, do you have any question or message or anything you would like to say to the listeners?
Mm.
Yeah, what would you say, ask,
Yeah. I
recommend?
would I would say there's one thing I would want to share. Um and it goes in a lot with a lot of work I do around reconciliation and decolonization and anti-racism in general. And I think the biggest message is start before you think you're ready, because there's so many times and spaces that I've been in where people are saying I'm afraid to start because I don't want to get it wrong, I don't want to offend anyone, I don't want to show up in a way that causes or further perpetuates harm for your community. um but I'm an Indigenous person. I have a good idea of what reconciliation could look like, but I'm not an expert either. And there are many wonderful, very educated, knowledgeable people in our communities, but they also have never felt what reconciliation actually looks or feels like when we're in practice together. And so we need to be able to have a bit more grace for ourselves in those relationship buildings. And I think we underestimate the significance that repair can have within our communities. If you're caught in a misstep, that's okay. We're all human beings. The repair is equally as important as taking those healthy risks to show up and stand in solidarity with our communities. So do it, do it before you think you're ready, because odds are you are ready. And odds are there will be someone there to catch you and walk alongside you.
Right. Um, yeah, but before I thank you for today's conversation, um, is there any question that I did not ask you today that I should have asked you?
I don't think so.
No? Okay, then I would like to thank you for doing everything you do, for who you are. Yeah, for your willingness to talk with me today and share your, part of your story with me and the listeners. Um, yeah, keep on doing what you do, and all the best.
Thank you. I really appreciate taking the space to be here with you in circle virtually. But um, the work you're doing is incredibly important, and I wish more people would take the time to walk, to talk, and to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.